In the heart of Atlanta, Captain Michael Turner and his wife Elise embark on a journey that will test their resilience, challenge their beliefs, and transform their community. Newly promoted to lead the city's police department, Michael steps into a role fraught with tension and distrust. But his determination to restore accountability and rebuild trust sets the stage for a series of events that will ripple through the precinct and the neighborhood alike. When a shocking encounter reveals deep-seated issues within the department, Michael launches an investigation that exposes a troubling pattern of misconduct. His actions ignite resistance from within the ranks and skepticism from the community. Yet, alongside Elise, a steadfast advocate for unity, Michael persists. Together, they face mounting pressure, personal sacrifices, and public scrutiny, fighting to prove that leadership built on integrity and compassion can bring meaningful change. As tensions rise and lines are drawn, alliances are forged in unexpected places. Michael and Elise work tirelessly to bridge the divide between law enforcement and the community, but the challenges ahead threaten to unravel everything they've fought for. Will their unwavering commitment be enough to overcome the odds? The afternoon sun cast long shadows across downtown Atlanta as Elise Turner sat on a park bench near the corner of 5th and Main. Her fingers gripped her phone tightly, the screen glowing with unread messages. She glanced around, her heart a mix of pride and apprehension. Her husband, Captain Michael Turner, had just been promoted to lead the city's police department, and they had agreed to meet here after his first official meeting in his new role. Elise adjusted her scarf against the gentle autumn breeze, her thoughts swirling. She was thrilled for Michael. He had worked tirelessly to earn this position, sacrificing countless evenings and weekends to protect the city. Yet, her excitement was tempered by a gnawing sense of unease. With his new role would come immense pressure, not just for him, but for their family. As Elise scrolled through her phone to pass the time, she noticed 2 police officers approaching. They moved with purpose, their uniforms crisp but their expressions cold. One was tall and stocky, his square jaw set in a hard line. The other was younger, with sharp eyes that darted nervously. "Excuse me, ma'am," the taller officer said, his voice clipped and authoritative. "What are you doing here?" Elise looked up, startled. She tucked her phone into her purse and offered a polite smile. "I am waiting for my husband. He's running a bit late." The officer's gaze narrowed. "Your husband, what's his name?" The younger officer shifted slightly, his hand resting on his belt. Elise's stomach tightened. Something about their demeanor unsettled her, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Captain Michael Turner," she replied, keeping her tone even. "He's the new head of the department." The officers exchanged a glance. Elise couldn't decipher their expressions. Was it disbelief, irritation, or something else entirely? The taller officer's voice hardened. "Stand up! We need to search you." Elise's heart sank. "Search me? For what? I'm just sitting here." "Ma'am, please cooperate," the younger officer interjected, his tone edged with impatience. Elise hesitated, her mind racing. She thought of resisting, of demanding an explanation. But she knew that escalating the situation would only make things worse. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her hands trembling as she held them up in surrender. The taller officer patted her down, while the younger one questioned her relentlessly. "Why are you sitting here? Do you have any identification? Are you carrying any weapons or illegal items?" "I told you," Elise said, her voice shaking. "I am waiting for my husband." Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she quickly reached for it, hoping it might be Michael. Sure enough, it was a text from him. "Hey, love, meeting ran late. Where are you?" Elise's fingers flew over the screen as she typed a quick reply. "On the corner of 5th and Main. 2 officers are harassing me. Please come quickly." Minutes later, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. Michael stepped out, his presence commanding even in the mundane act of closing the car door. His uniform was immaculate, his badge gleaming in the sunlight. His face was calm, but Elise could see the fire simmering in his eyes as he approached. "What seems to be the problem here?" Michael asked, his deep voice steady but unmistakably firm. The taller officer straightened, his expression shifting from suspicion to a mixture of uncertainty and defensiveness. "Routine stop, Captain." She seemed suspicious. Michael's gaze darkened, though his tone remained composed. "Suspicious? Sitting on a bench?" The younger officer cleared his throat nervously. "She looked out of place," he mumbled. Elise watched as Michael's jaw tightened, the only visible sign of his rising anger. He turned his piercing gaze on the two officers. "Out of place? This is my wife. Your actions are unacceptable." The officers froze, realization dawning on their faces. The taller officer stammered, "Captain, we didn't know." "You didn't care to know," Michael interrupted sharply. "You saw a woman sitting alone and assumed she was a threat. That's not policing. That's bias." For a moment, there was silence, the weight of Michael's words hanging in the air. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence eroded. "You are dismissed," Michael said firmly. "Report back to the precinct immediately." The officers nodded, their faces pale as they walked away, heads lowered. As the SUV pulled away from the scene, Elise sat in silence beside Michael. Her hands were still trembling, but the overwhelming sense of relief began to settle over her. "Are you okay?" Michael asked, his voice soft now. Elise nodded, though tears welled in her eyes. I didn't think." Michael reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. It's exactly the kind of behavior I've sworn to root out." His words brought her some comfort, but they also reminded her of the challenges ahead. She looked at him, her heart filled with a mixture of pride and worry. "Michael, you're stepping into a storm. Are you ready for it?" Michael's expression was resolute. "I have to be. This isn't just about us, Elise. It's about making things better for everyone." As they drove home, Elise felt a renewed sense of purpose stirring within her. She had seen firsthand how easily prejudice could surface, even from those sworn to protect. And now, as the wife of a man determined to bring change, she realized that her role would be just as important. The journey ahead would be difficult, but Elise vowed to stand by Michael every step of the way. Together, they would face the challenges, not just for themselves, but for the city they called home. The drive home was quieter than Elise expected. Michael gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw set in an expression she had seen only a few times before controlled anger. The encounter with the officers lingered in her mind, but she knew better than to push him to talk. He would speak when he was ready. When they reached their small but cozy house on the outskirts of the city, Elise stepped out of the SUV and paused. The familiar sight of their home, with its neatly trimmed hedges and warm, inviting porch light, usually brought her comfort. Tonight, it felt different. Michael unlocked the door, letting Elise step inside first. She set her purse on the entryway table and turned to face him. "Michael," she began, her voice soft but steady, "we need to talk about what happened." He sighed deeply, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know, Elise. He paused, his words trailing off. Elise placed a hand on his arm. "You've worked so hard to get here, but today was a reminder that there's still so much to fix. I'm proud of you, but I need to know, are you ready for what this might mean? For us? For you?" Michael met her gaze, his brown eyes heavy with resolve. "I'm ready. I didn't take this job expecting it to be easy. What happened today only reinforces why I'm here. But that doesn't mean it won't be hard." Elise nodded, her own resolve hardening. "Then we'll face it together." The next morning, Michael arrived at the precinct earlier than usual. The atmosphere was tense, a quiet hum of murmured conversations and sidelong glances following him as he walked through the halls. Word of the incident had spread quickly, as had Michael's reaction. Chief Wallace called Michael into his office, gesturing for him to take a seat. The chief was an imposing figure, with a reputation for pragmatism, his sharp eyes missing nothing. "I heard about what happened yesterday," Wallace said, leaning forward. "Those two officers, Bradley and Harris, have been a problem before. This isn't the first complaint we've received about their conduct." Michael stiffened. "Then why are they still in the field?" Wallace sighed, a shadow of frustration crossing his face. "Politics, red tape, the usual excuses. But now that you're here, Captain Turner, I expect you to clean house. If there's anyone who can, it's you." Michael nodded. "I'll start an internal investigation. This department can't afford to turn a blind eye any longer." Wallace's expression softened slightly. "I respect that. Just be prepared there will be pushback. Not everyone will be thrilled with your approach." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Michael said. Back at home, Elise spent the morning tending to her garden, trying to soothe the lingering unease from the previous day. The vibrant flowers and soft rustling of leaves usually brought her peace, but today her thoughts were elsewhere. As she watered the roses, her neighbor, Mrs. Carter, waved from across the fence. The older woman's kind face and gentle demeanor were a constant source of reassurance for Elise. "Good morning, Elise," Mrs. Carter called. "You look like you have something on your mind." Elise hesitated, then walked over to the fence. "Good morning. It's just been a lot lately. Michael's new role is already proving complicated." Mrs. Carter nodded knowingly. "Leadership always is, dear, but you two have always faced challenges with grace. This will be no different." Elise smiled, feeling a flicker of reassurance. "Thank you. I needed that." Mrs. Carter patted her hand. "Remember, Elise, you're not alone. Sometimes a kind word or a helping hand can make all the difference." That evening, Michael returned home later than usual, his face lined with fatigue. He sat at the dining table as Elise placed a plate of food in front of him. "How was your day?" Elise asked, sitting across from him. Michael took a deep breath. "Long. I started looking into Bradley and Harris's records. There's a pattern, a disturbing one. Complaints, disciplinary actions swept under the rug. It's worse than I thought." Elise frowned. "What are you going to do?" "Dig deeper," Michael said. "I've already spoken to a few officers. Some are willing to cooperate, but others, not so much." Elise reached across the table, taking his hand. "You're doing the right thing, Michael, but this won't be easy. You'll need allies both in the department and outside of it." Michael nodded, his grip on her hand tightening. "I know, and I'll need you too." "You'll always have me," Elise said softly. The next day, Michael held a meeting with his officers, addressing the issue head-on. He stood at the front of the room, his tone firm but measured. "We have a responsibility to this city," Michael began, "to uphold the law with fairness and integrity. Recent events have made it clear that we've fallen short of that standard. This is not a witch hunt. This is accountability." The room was silent, the weight of his words pressing on everyone present. Michael could see the mixture of reactions, some nodding in agreement, others bristling with resistance. Bradley and Harris sat near the back, their expressions defiant. Michael ignored them, focusing instead on those who looked ready to support change. "This isn't just about following rules," Michael continued. "It's about restoring trust. If we don't have the trust of the community, we have nothing." As the meeting concluded, a few officers approached Michael, quietly offering their support. It was a start, but Michael knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. That evening, as Michael and Elise sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Elise broke the silence. "I'm thinking of organizing something." Michael raised an eyebrow. "What kind of something?" "A community forum," Elise said. "A chance for people to share their experiences with the police, good and bad. If we're going to rebuild trust, it has to start with listening." Michael smiled, a flicker of hope lighting his tired eyes. "That's a great idea, Elise. I think it's exactly what we need. Elise leaned against his shoulder, feeling the weight of the day begin to lift. Together, they were stronger than the challenges ahead. And as the city lights flickered in the distance, they knew they had taken the first steps toward something greater. The precinct buzzed with quiet tension as Michael Turner sifted through a mountain of paperwork in his office. Reports, complaints, and disciplinary records were scattered across his desk. Bradley and Harris's names appeared far too often, linked to incidents of profiling, unwarranted stops, and complaints of harassment. Michael leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. The deeper he delved into the department's history, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated problem. It was systemic, woven into the fabric of the precinct's culture. A knock on the door jolted him from his thoughts. Detective Carmen Hayes, one of the precinct's most respected officers, stood in the doorway. "Captain," she said, stepping inside. "You wanted to see me?" Michael gestured to a chair. "Carmen, I need your help. I'm putting together an internal investigation, and I need someone I can trust." Carmen sat down, her expression serious. "What's the scope?" "Broad," Michael admitted. "Bradley and Harris are at the center, but this goes deeper. I need to know who else might be involved, and why this behavior has been allowed to continue." Carmen nodded slowly. "You know this won't sit well with some people. You'll ruffle feathers." Michael met her gaze, his resolve firm. "Let them be ruffled. This isn't about being popular. It's about doing what's right." At home, Elise sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and pen, brainstorming ideas for the community forum. She had already reached out to a few local leaders and was working on a list of speakers who could provide a range of perspectives. Her phone buzzed with a message from Grace, a fellow community organizer she had met through Mrs. Carter. "Heard about your idea for the forum. Count me in. Let's meet soon to discuss logistics." Elise smiled, feeling a flicker of hope. With Grace's experience and connections, the forum could be exactly what the community needed. As she jotted down ideas, Michael walked in, his shoulders heavy with fatigue. He poured himself a glass of water and sat across from Elise, watching her scribble notes. "Busy day?" she asked, glancing up. Michael nodded. "You could say that. Carmen's on board, but this investigation is going to be a long haul. Some people are already pushing back." Elise reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "Change is never easy, but you're not alone in this, Michael. We'll get through it together." Her words seemed to ease some of the tension in his shoulders. "Speaking of change," he said, "how's the forum coming along?" Elise smiled. "It's coming together. Grace is helping, and I think we'll have a good turnout." Michael's expression softened. "You're amazing, you know that?" Elise chuckled. "I try." The next day, Michael and Carmen began interviewing officers. Some were cooperative, sharing concerns they had long kept quiet. Others were defensive, refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing. Bradley and Harris, predictably, fell into the latter category. As Michael questioned them, their attitudes shifted between defiance and dismissal. "This is a waste of time," Bradley said, his tone laced with disdain. "We've done nothing wrong." Michael's eyes narrowed. "I've reviewed your record, Officer Bradley. It tells a different story. Care to explain why so many complaints are linked to your badge number?" Bradley leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You know how it is, Captain. People don't like being held accountable. They'll say anything to get out of trouble." Michael remained calm, his voice steady. "Accountability applies to all of us, Bradley. If you're doing your job right, you have nothing to worry about. But if you're not—" Bradley said nothing, his defiance faltering under Michael's unwavering gaze. As the investigation unfolded, Elise and Grace worked tirelessly to organize the forum. They secured a venue at the community center and distributed flyers around the neighborhood. Elise reached out to local businesses and churches, inviting them to participate. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life expressed interest, eager to share their stories and be part of the conversation. One evening, Elise received a call from Karen, a single mother who had experienced police harassment while trying to pick up her son from school. "I'm nervous about speaking," Karen admitted, "but I think it's important. People need to know what's happening." Elise reassured her, "Your story matters, Karen. You're brave for sharing it, and I'll be right there with you." The night of the forum arrived, and the community center buzzed with anticipation. Chairs filled quickly, the crowd a diverse mix of residents, business owners, and local leaders. Michael and Carmen stood near the back, observing quietly as Elise took the stage. Elise began with a simple message. "We're here tonight to listen, to learn, and to grow. Change starts with understanding, and understanding starts with stories." One by one, community members shared their experiences, some heartbreaking, others hopeful. Karen spoke about her encounter with the police, her voice trembling but steady. Marcus, a local photographer, described how a supportive officer had helped him turn his life around. Michael listened intently, his heart heavy but resolved. Each story reaffirmed why he had taken this job, why he couldn't back down. As the forum ended, Elise invited Michael to speak. He hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, his presence commanding the room. "I've heard a lot tonight," Michael began, his voice steady. "Some of it hard to hear, all of it important. I can't promise to fix everything overnight, but I can promise this. I will listen, I will act, and I will hold myself and this department accountable." The room erupted in applause. For the first time in weeks, Michael felt a glimmer of hope, not just for the department, but for the community as a whole. That night, as Michael and Elise walked home, the weight of the day began to lift. "You were incredible," Elise said, slipping her hand into his. Michael smiled, his steps lighter than they had been in weeks. "So were you. I couldn't do this without you." As they approached their house, Elise glanced at the stars overhead. "We've started something important, Michael. Something that matters." Michael nodded. "And we'll see it through together." The morning air felt heavy as Michael Turner walked into the precinct. The once familiar rhythm of the day had shifted, replaced by a tense undercurrent that followed him wherever he went. Officers who once greeted him with respect now avoided his gaze, their murmured conversations ceasing the moment he entered a room. Michael tried to ignore the tension as he sat at his desk, reviewing the latest reports from Carmen. The investigation was progressing, but not without resistance. Bradley and Harris remained defiant, and several other officers were beginning to push back. Rumors swirled through the department claims that Michael's efforts were dividing the team, that he was prioritizing politics over loyalty. The knock on his office door startled him. Chief Wallace stepped inside, his expression grave. "Captain Turner," Wallace said, closing the door behind him. "We need to talk." Michael gestured to a chair, bracing himself. "What's on your mind, Chief?" Wallace sighed, his tone measured. "I've been hearing complaints. Some of the officers feel you're targeting them unfairly. They think you're turning this department into a battlefield." Michael's jaw tightened. "I'm holding people accountable, Chief. If that feels like a battlefield, maybe it's because we've let the wrong things slide for too long." Wallace nodded slowly, his face unreadable. "I understand your point, Michael. I do, but you need to tread carefully. Change is important, but if you alienate the entire department, you won't have anyone left to support you." Michael leaned forward, his tone unwavering. "With respect, Chief, the officers who can't support accountability shouldn't be here in the first place. This isn't about loyalty to me, it's about loyalty to the people we serve." Wallace held his gaze for a long moment before nodding. "I hope you're ready for what's coming. Not everyone shares your resolve." At home, Elise felt the weight of the backlash in her own way. News of Michael's investigation had spread through their neighborhood, and not all the reactions were positive. Some friends and neighbors voiced their support, while others questioned whether Michael's actions would bring more harm than good. During her morning coffee, Elise received an unexpected visit from Janet, a longtime neighbor. Janet hesitated on the porch, her face lined with concern. "May I come in?" Janet asked. Elise nodded, stepping aside. "Of course. What's going on?" Janet sat at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly. "Elise, I've been hearing things. People are saying Michael's investigation is stirring up trouble, that it's going to make things harder for everyone." Elise poured them both a cup of coffee, choosing her words carefully. "Janet, I know change can feel uncomfortable, even scary. But what Michael is doing isn't about creating trouble. It's about fixing what's broken. If we ignore the problems, they'll only get worse." Janet sighed. "I know you're right, but some people are afraid. They think this will divide the community even more." Elise reached across the table, placing a hand on Janet's. "I understand their fear, but doing nothing isn't an option. Michael is fighting for something bigger than himself for all of us." Janet nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. At the precinct, tensions reached a boiling point during a meeting. As Michael addressed the team, outlining the next steps in the investigation, Bradley stood up, his face a mask of anger. "With all due respect, Captain," Bradley said, his voice sharp, "this so-called investigation is a joke. You're tearing this department apart over a few complaints from people who don't like being held accountable." A murmur rippled through the room. Michael held up a hand, silencing the crowd. His gaze locked on Bradley, calm but firm. "Accountability isn't optional, Officer Bradley," Michael said. "And this isn't about a few complaints. This is about patterns of behavior that undermine trust in our department. If we can't police ourselves, we have no right to police this city." Bradley scoffed. "You're making us look weak." Michael's voice didn't waver. "No, Officer Bradley. We're showing strength, the strength to confront our flaws and become better." The room fell silent. Bradley sat down, his defiance still evident. But Michael could see the wheels turning in some of his colleagues' minds. Elise, meanwhile, was busy preparing for the next community forum. The turnout for the first event had exceeded her expectations, and she was determined to keep the momentum going. One afternoon, she met with Grace at the community center to finalize the details. Grace placed a stack of flyers on the table, her enthusiasm contagious. "The community is rallying around this, Elise," Grace said. "You and Michael are inspiring people. Don't let the naysayers get to you." Elise smiled, grateful for Grace's support. "It helps to hear that. Some days it feels like we're swimming upstream." Grace chuckled. "That's how you know you're on the right path. Change isn't supposed to be easy." The backlash began to shift as the investigation uncovered undeniable evidence of misconduct. Bradley and Harris's records revealed a troubling pattern, including reports that had been buried or ignored. Michael shared his findings with Chief Wallace, who agreed to escalate the investigation to internal affairs. At home, Michael confided in Elise about the mounting pressure. "Some days it feels like I'm fighting a losing battle," he admitted one evening, his head in his hands. Elise sat beside him, her hand resting on his back. "You're not losing, Michael. You're making progress, and you're showing people what real leadership looks like." Michael looked up, the weight in his eyes momentarily lifting. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Elise." "You won't have to find out," Elise said with a small smile. As the weeks went on, the tide began to turn. More officers came forward to support Michael's efforts, sharing their own frustrations with the department's shortcomings. The community forum drew an even larger crowd than the first, with residents voicing both their concerns and their hopes for the future. Michael and Elise faced the backlash together, their determination unwavering. Each small victory an officer willing to speak up, a resident expressing gratitude, fueled their resolve. The road ahead was still long, but as Michael and Elise sat together one quiet evening, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, They knew they were moving in the right direction. "We're making a difference," Michael said, his voice steady. Elise nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "And we're just getting started." The next community forum was held on a crisp Saturday evening, the air buzzing with anticipation as residents packed the community center. The space was brighter this time, not just from the additional lighting, but from the growing sense of unity that had taken root in the neighborhood. Elise stood at the front of the room, a confident smile on her face despite the fluttering nerves in her stomach. Michael sat in the back, his uniform as sharp as ever. He had chosen to observe rather than speak at the start, wanting to give the community space to express themselves. He watched Elise with quiet admiration as she addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Elise began, her voice steady. "Your willingness to share your stories and ideas is what makes this effort meaningful. Change isn't something that happens overnight, but together we can make progress." The room erupted in applause, a reflection of the trust Elise had built with the community. As the forum progressed, residents took turns sharing their experiences. An elderly man named Mr. Jenkins spoke about a time decade earlier when an officer had helped him after his car broke down in the middle of the night. His voice cracked with emotion as he expressed his hope that policing could return to those roots of service and care. Karen, the single mother who had spoken at the previous forum, shared an update. "Since the last forum, I've seen officers trying to engage with us. It's a small step, but it means something. It gives me hope." Marcus, the young photographer, stood next. He held up a series of black and white photos depicting quiet but powerful moments in the neighborhood: children playing, neighbors chatting, officers walking the beat. "This is who we are," Marcus said, his voice ringing with conviction. "We're a community, and it's up to all of us to protect that." Michael felt a swell of pride and humility. These were the voices he was fighting for, the lives he wanted to protect and uplift. As the forum concluded, Elise invited Michael to speak. He hesitated for a moment, then stood, his presence commanding as he walked to the front of the room. "Good evening," Michael began, his voice steady. "I've been listening tonight, and I want to thank you all for your honesty and courage. It's not easy to share your experiences, especially the painful ones. But it's through these conversations that we find the truth, and the truth is where real change begins." He paused, scanning the room. "As your police captain, I'm committed to making this department better. That means holding ourselves accountable, earning your trust, and working alongside you, not above you. This is a partnership, and I'm here to honor that." The crowd erupted in applause. Elise caught Michael's eye, her smile filled with pride and encouragement. In the days following the forum, something remarkable began to happen. Local organizations reached out to offer their support, from churches volunteering their spaces for future events, to small businesses donating supplies. Grace, always resourceful, helped Elise organize a series of workshops aimed at fostering dialogue between officers and residents. The first workshop was held at a local church. Officers and community members sat in small groups, sharing their perspectives and finding common ground. One group included Bradley, who had reluctantly agreed to attend. Elise watched from a distance as Bradley engaged in a quiet but earnest conversation with Mr. Jenkins. Though she couldn't hear their words, the sight of them speaking was a small victory in itself. Meanwhile, Michael's efforts at the precinct were yielding results. Carmen had uncovered additional misconduct in the records, leading to further disciplinary actions. While some officers still resisted, others began to step forward, offering their support. One afternoon, Officer Diaz, a young recruit, approached Michael in the hallway. "Captain Turner," Diaz began, his tone hesitant, "I just wanted to say I appreciate what you're doing. I became a cop to help people, and it means a lot to see someone standing up for that." Michael nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you, Diaz. We need more officers like you." The exchange bolstered Michael's resolve. For every detractor, there were allies like Diaz who believed in his vision for a better department. As the weeks passed, the neighborhood began to change in subtle but meaningful ways. Officers were seen walking the streets more often, engaging with residents instead of merely patrolling. Complaints of misconduct decreased, and conversations at the precinct shifted towards solutions rather than blame. Elise continued to organize forums and workshops, each one building on the momentum of the last. She became a trusted figure in the community, her calm demeanor and unwavering commitment inspiring those around her. One evening, as she and Michael walked through the neighborhood hand in hand, they noticed small but powerful signs of progress. A group of teenagers played basketball at a court that had once been a hotspot for tension between residents and police. Nearby, an officer chatted with a group of parents, his presence welcomed rather than feared. "This is what it's all about," Elise said softly. Michael nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "It's a start, but there's still so much to do." That night, Elise received an unexpected call from Karen. "I just wanted to say thank you," Karen said, her voice filled with emotion. "For organizing these forums, for giving us a voice. You've made a real difference." Elise smiled, her heart full. "Thank you, Karen, but it's not just me. It's all of us, working together." As she hung up the phone, Elise felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would still be challenging, but the progress they had made showed that change was possible and worth fighting for. Michael and Elise's efforts had turned into a movement, one that inspired both the department and the community to strive for something better. Together, they had faced resistance, doubt, and fear, but they had also found hope, courage, and unity. As they sat on their porch that evening, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Michael turned to Elise. "We're doing something important," he said, his voice steady. Elise nodded, her smile bright. "And we're doing it together." The precinct's atmosphere was heavy as Michael Turner reviewed the findings of the internal investigation. The evidence against officers Bradley and Harris was damning multiple incidents of misconduct, corroborated by complaints, reports, and even testimonies from fellow officers. The weight of the findings left little doubt. Decisive action had to be taken. Michael stood, adjusting his uniform as he prepared to present the case to Chief Wallace. His steps were steady, but his thoughts churned with the knowledge of what this might mean. While he had allies, resistance within the department had grown louder, and this decision would undoubtedly draw even sharper lines. When he reached Wallace's office, the chief was waiting, his expression grim. "Come in, Captain," he said, motioning for Michael to sit. Michael handed Wallace the report. "The evidence is clear. Bradley and Harris's actions violate the very principles we're sworn to uphold. I recommend their immediate suspension and referral to Internal Affairs." Wallace leafed through the report, his brows furrowing. After several moments of silence, he set the file down. "This is thorough work, Michael, but you know this won't go over smoothly. Higher-ups are already questioning whether this investigation is worth the fallout." Michael's jaw tightened. "Respectfully, Chief, avoiding fallout has cost this department its integrity. If we let this slide, we're telling our officers and the community that misconduct is acceptable. I won't be part of that." Wallace studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You have my support. Prepare the necessary paperwork, and I'll authorize the suspensions." News of the suspensions spread quickly, sending shockwaves through the precinct. Some officers viewed the decision as overdue accountability, while others saw it as an attack on their ranks. Bradley and Harris's vocal dissent only added fuel to the fire, their accusations of unfair treatment sowing seeds of division. Elise felt the ripple effects at home. Conversations with neighbors often turned to heated debates about the investigation. While many supported Michael's actions, others voiced concerns that the scrutiny would damage the department's morale. During a visit to the local market, Elise overheard a small group discussing the situation. "They're making an example out of good officers," one man said, shaking his head. "How's that supposed to help anyone?" Elise, unable to stay silent, stepped closer. "It helps by showing that no one is above accountability. Protecting the community means holding ourselves to the highest standards, even when it's uncomfortable." The group fell silent, their expressions ranging from surprised to thoughtful. Elise walked away, her heart pounding, but her resolve intact. At the precinct, Michael faced his own battles. One morning, as he entered the briefing room, he was met with a palpable chill. Officers who had once greeted him warmly now offered curt nods or looked away altogether. Detective Carmen Hayes joined him as he reviewed the day's assignments. "They'll come around," she said quietly. Michael sighed. "I'm not so sure. Change like this doesn't make friends." Carmen gave him a pointed look. "Maybe not, but it does make progress. You're doing the right thing, Captain. Don't forget that." Her words bolstered him, reminding him that the fight wasn't about popularity, it was about integrity. Meanwhile, Elise continued her work within the community. She collaborated with Grace to organize a series of bridge-building events, bringing officers and residents together for activities that encouraged understanding and cooperation. One such event was held at a local park. Families, business owners, and officers gathered for a day of games, food, and conversation. Michael attended, his presence initially met with wary glances from some, but warm greetings from others. As the day unfolded, barriers began to break down. A group of teenagers challenged the officers to a basketball game, laughter and camaraderie filling the air as they played. Elise watched with a sense of pride, knowing these small moments were the foundation of lasting change. Michael joined her under a shady tree, a rare smile on his face. "This is what it's all about," he said, gesturing to the bustling scene. Elise nodded, her heart full. "It's a start, and every start matters." Back at the precinct, Michael's resolve was tested again. An anonymous complaint had been filed against him, accusing him of fostering division within the department. While the claim was baseless, it was a clear attempt to undermine his authority. Chief Wallace called Michael into his office. "I don't put stock in this complaint," Wallace said, his tone firm. "But you should know the pressure from above is growing. They want this investigation to quietly fade away." Michael's response was immediate. "With respect, Chief, that's not going to happen. This isn't about politics. It's about doing what's right." Wallace's lips twitched in a faint smile. "Good, because that's exactly what I expect from you." At home, Michael confided in Elise about the mounting pressure. They sat on the couch, the room dimly lit by a single lamp. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm making things worse," Michael admitted, his voice heavy. Elise reached for his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "You're making things better, Michael. Better isn't always easy, but it's always worth it." Her words steadied him, reminding him of why he had taken this role in the first place. As the days turned into weeks, the tide began to shift. Policies addressing bias and misconduct were implemented, and mandatory training sessions were scheduled for all officers. The changes were met with mixed reactions, but Michael remained focused on the progress they represented. One evening, as he reviewed the training curriculum with Carmen, she remarked, "You've set something in motion, Captain. It's bigger than this department now." Michael leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "It's not just me, it's everyone who's willing to stand up and say we can do better." At the next community forum, Elise and Michael stood side by side, addressing a crowd that had grown even larger. The energy in the room was different, less tense, more hopeful. Michael spoke about the steps the department was taking. His words met with nods of approval and occasional applause. Elise shared updates on the bridge-building events, emphasizing the importance of continuing the dialogue. As the forum concluded, a young woman approached Michael. "Captain Turner," she said, her voice hesitant but steady, I just wanted to thank you. My brother was treated unfairly by the police last year, and seeing you take this stand gives me hope that things can change." Michael's throat tightened. "Thank you for sharing that. Change is slow, but it's happening, and it's because of people like you." That night, as Michael and Elise sat on their porch, they reflected on the progress they had made. "We're turning the tide," Elise said softly. Michael nodded, a rare sense of peace settling over him. "And we'll keep going, together." Michael sat in his office at the precinct, his head bowed over a stack of reports. The weight of the investigation, the departmental backlash, and the mounting demands of his role pressed heavily on him. Despite the small victories, the progress felt fragile, as though it could unravel at any moment. His phone buzzed with a text from Elise. "Don't forget to eat something. You can't fix the world on an empty stomach." Michael smiled faintly and glanced at the untouched sandwich sitting beside him. Elise had a way of keeping him grounded, even from miles away. He took a bite, but the food felt tasteless against the backdrop of his exhaustion. At home, Elise was also feeling the strain. The forums and community events were rewarding, but they were emotionally draining. Every story she heard of bias, of loss, of fractured trust, cut deeply. She carried those stories with her, even as she tried to focus on organizing the next event or comforting Michael after a grueling day. She sat at the dining table, her notebook open, jotting down ideas for an upcoming workshop. Her pen paused mid-sentence as a wave of fatigue washed over her. For a moment, she rested her head on her arms, the quiet of the house amplifying the weight she felt. The door opened, and Michael stepped inside, his uniform slightly rumpled. He set his keys on the counter and walked over to Elise, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Tough day?" he asked softly. Elise looked up at him, her smile faint. "More like a tough week, but nothing I can't handle." Michael sat beside her, his gaze searching. "I don't want this to burn you out, Elise. You've taken on so much." "So have you," she countered, "and you're still standing. We're in this together, Michael. We always have been." That night, they sat on the couch, a rare moment of quiet between them. Michael leaned his head back, his eyes closed, while Elise rested her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever wonder if it's worth it?" Michael asked after a long silence. Elise tilted her head to look at him. "Of course I do. But then I think about the people who are counting on us, the ones who've shared their stories, the ones who believe in what we're doing. They remind me why we started this." Michael nodded, her words a balm to his weary spirit. The next morning, Elise visited the community center to finalize plans for the next forum. Grace greeted her with a warm smile, but Elise could see the concern in her friend's eyes. "You look tired," Grace said gently. Elise waved her off. "I'm fine. There's just so much to do." Grace placed a hand on Elise's arm. "You don't have to do it all alone. Lean on us. That's what community is for." Elise hesitated, then nodded. "You're right. It's just hard to ask for help sometimes." Grace smiled. "Then consider this me offering it without you asking." At the precinct, Michael faced his own challenges. The anonymous complaint against him had been dismissed, but the rumor mill continued to churn. Some officers avoided him altogether, while others remained overtly resistant to the changes he was implementing. During a department meeting, Michael outlined the upcoming bias training sessions. As he spoke, he noticed the tension in the room, the crossed arms, the tight jaws, the muttered comments. "Any questions?" Michael asked, his tone steady. Officer Bradley, now suspended but still vocal, stood. "Yeah, Captain. When does this witch hunt end?" A murmur spread through the room. Michael met Bradley's glare head-on. "This isn't a witch hunt," Michael said firmly. "It's about accountability and improvement. If that feels like an attack, maybe you should ask yourself why." The room fell silent. Bradley sat down, his expression sour. Michael took a breath, the moment underscoring how far they still had to go. At home that evening, Michael found Elise in the garden, pulling weeds with methodical precision. He walked over, crouching beside her. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Elise smiled faintly. "I could ask you the same thing?" Michael reached for her hand, pausing her work. "You've been my rock through all of this. I don't say it enough, but I couldn't do this without you." Her eyes softened. "And I couldn't do it without you. We're stronger together, Michael. Even when it's hard." They stayed like that for a while, the quiet of the evening offering a rare sense of peace. The next forum drew an even larger crowd, a testament to the growing momentum behind their efforts. Elise stood at the front of the room, her voice steady, despite the exhaustion she felt. "Change isn't easy," she said, addressing the crowd. "It requires sacrifice, persistence, and faith. But every step forward, no matter how small, brings us closer to the community we want to be." Michael listened from the back, her words resonating deeply. He thought about the sacrifices they had both made, the sleepless nights, the strained relationships, the moments of doubt. Yet here they were, still moving forward. After the forum, a young woman approached Elise. Her name was Tasha, and she had just started attending the events. "I wanted to thank you," Tasha said, her voice quiet but sincere. "You and your husband are doing something incredible. It's inspiring." Elise smiled, her heart swelling. "Thank you, Tasha. That means a lot." Tasha hesitated, then added, "I'd like to help. Whatever you need organizing, spreading the word I'm in." Elise's smile widened. "We'd love that. Thank you." As the weeks went on, the challenges remained, but so did the progress. Officers who had once resisted the changes began to participate in the training sessions, their perspectives slowly shifting. Community members who had been skeptical began to voice their support. Michael and Elise leaned on each other more than ever, finding strength in their partnership and the community they were helping to rebuild. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Michael looked at Elise, his expression thoughtful. "We've given so much to this," he said. "But look at what's come of it. It's worth every sacrifice." Elise nodded, her smile bright. "And we're not done yet." The stars twinkled above them, a quiet reminder of the light they were bringing to a city that desperately needed it. The precinct was eerily quiet the morning the final decisions regarding Officers Bradley and Harris were announced. Michael stood in his office, staring at the printed report on his desk. The investigation had been thorough, and the evidence irrefutable. Both officers were found guilty of misconduct. Bradley faced termination, while Harris was suspended without pay, pending additional training and oversight. Michael knew the decision would spark a storm, both inside the department and within the community. He took a deep breath, straightened his uniform, and prepared to address his team. The briefing room buzzed with tension as officers filed in, their faces a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and defiance. Michael stood at the front, his expression calm but resolute. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady. "The investigation into Officers Bradley and Harris has concluded. Based on the findings, disciplinary actions have been taken." He paused, scanning the room. This wasn't an easy decision, nor was it made lightly, but it was necessary. Accountability is the cornerstone of trust, and without trust, we cannot serve this community. The room was silent for a moment before the murmurs began. Some officers nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Bradley's absence was palpable, his dismissal a stark reminder of the consequences of failing to uphold the department's standards. One officer raised his hand. "Captain Turner, does this mean more investigations are coming?" Michael met his gaze. "It means every officer in this department is held to the same standard, myself included. Our mission is to serve and protect, and that begins with integrity." The room fell quiet again, the weight of his words sinking in. At home, Elise listened as Michael recounted the day's events. They sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in front of each of them. "How did they take it?" Elise asked. "As expected," Michael said with a sigh. "Some were supportive, but others, not so much. It's going to take time for everyone to adjust." Elise reached for his hand. "You've done what needed to be done, Michael. Change isn't easy, but it's worth it." Michael nodded, her words a steadying force. News of the disciplinary actions spread quickly, igniting a firestorm of reactions. Local news outlets picked up the story, their coverage ranging from praise for Michael's leadership to criticism of his handling of the department. Community responses were equally divided. Some residents expressed relief and gratitude, seeing the actions as a step toward justice. Others worried about the impact on public safety, questioning whether the scrutiny would discourage officers from doing their jobs effectively. One evening, Elise and Michael attended a town hall meeting where residents aired their concerns. "Captain Turner," a man in the audience said, his tone sharp, "how can we trust the police to protect us if they're too busy looking over their shoulders?" Michael stood, his posture confident. "Accountability doesn't weaken us, it makes us stronger. By addressing misconduct, we're ensuring that the officers who serve you are worthy of your trust. That trust is essential for you and for us." The room was silent for a moment before a woman near the front stood. "Thank you, Captain. For years, we've felt unheard. This is the first time I've seen real action. It gives me hope." Applause rippled through the room, a small but significant victory in the face of lingering doubt. Elise continued her work in the community, organizing forums and workshops to bridge the gap between residents and law enforcement. At one event, she invited Tasha, the young woman who had recently joined her efforts, to share her perspective. Tasha spoke with quiet conviction. "It's easy to feel powerless when things seem broken, but seeing people like Elise and Captain Turner fight for change has shown me that we all have a role to play. We just have to step up." Her words resonated with the audience, sparking a conversation about collective responsibility and the power of community. Elise felt a surge of pride watching Tasha grow into a leader in her own right. Back at the precinct, Michael focused on implementing the new policies and training sessions that had been approved in the wake of the investigation. The sessions were mandatory, covering topics like implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and community engagement. Detective Carmen Hayes led many of the sessions, her reputation lending credibility to the effort. Some officers participated reluctantly, but others embraced the opportunity to learn and grow. One day, Officer Diaz approached Michael after a session. "Captain Turner," Diaz said, "I just wanted to say these trainings are making a difference. I've already started seeing things differently on the job." Michael's face softened. "That means a lot, Diaz. Keep it up." Despite the progress, the strain on Michael and Elise was undeniable. The backlash, the long hours, and the emotional toll of their work weighed heavily on them. One evening, Elise prepared a quiet dinner, hoping to create a moment of calm. As they ate, Michael opened up. "Sometimes I wonder if we're making enough of a difference," he admitted, his voice tinged with doubt. Elise reached across the table, her hand covering his. "You're making more of a difference than you realize. Every step forward matters, Michael, and you're showing people what true leadership looks like." Her words steadied him, reminding him of the progress they had made together. As the weeks passed, the department began to shift. Complaints of misconduct decreased, and the community's trust slowly started to rebuild. Officers who had once resisted the changes began to see their value, and relationships between law enforcement and residents improved. Michael and Elise's efforts were far from over, but they had reached a turning point. The challenges they had faced had not broken them, they had strengthened their resolve. One evening, Michael and Elise stood on their porch, the city lights twinkling in the distance. "We've come so far," Michael said, his voice steady. Elise smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "And we're just getting started." The morning light filtered through the precinct windows, as Michael Turner reviewed a list of upcoming events designed to bring officers and the community together. He had worked closely with Elise, Grace, and other community leaders to craft a series of gatherings aimed at fostering understanding and collaboration. From town halls to neighborhood patrol walks, each initiative was a step toward bridging the gap that years of mistrust had created. Michael leaned back in his chair, scanning the agenda. A barbecue at the park, a youth mentorship program kickoff, and a coffee with a cop event, all seemingly small gestures, but ones he hoped would have lasting impact. A knock on his office door pulled him from his thoughts. Detective Carmen Hayes stepped inside, holding a clipboard. "Captain, I've been reviewing the sign-ups for the mentorship program," she said, a faint smile playing on her lips. "We've got more volunteers than expected. Looks like the department's starting to get behind this." Michael allowed himself a rare smile. "That's good news. It's a start, but we've got a long way to go." Elise was equally busy at home, preparing for the park barbecue that was scheduled for the weekend. Her dining table was covered in flyers, volunteer lists, and supplies donated by local businesses. Tasha sat across from her, folding pamphlets and chatting enthusiastically about the event. "You know," Tasha said, "a year ago, I wouldn't have believed something like this was possible. It's amazing to see so many people coming together." Elise smiled. "It's been a long road, but the progress is real. People are starting to believe in the power of community again." Tasha nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You and Captain Turner have inspired that. You've shown us what's possible when people don't give up." Elise felt a swell of pride, but quickly deflected. "It's not just us. It's everyone who's stepped up and said they want better for themselves, for their neighbors, for the city." The barbecue turned out to be a resounding success. Families filled the park, the smell of grilled burgers and hot dogs mingling with the laughter of children playing on the swings. Officers mingled with residents, sharing stories and building connections that had long been missing. Michael manned the grill for a while, exchanging light-hearted banter with neighbors and officers alike. Elise moved through the crowd, chatting with residents and ensuring everything ran smoothly. At one table, a group of teenagers engaged in a lively conversation with Officer Diaz, who had volunteered to oversee the mentorship program. "You mean we actually get to ride along in a patrol car?" one boy asked, his eyes wide with excitement. Diaz chuckled. "Not yet, but we'll start with workshops and discussions. We'll show you what the job's really about, helping people." Michael watched the interaction from a distance, a faint smile on his face. These were the moments he had hoped for, moments where barriers began to dissolve and trust started to grow. As the evening wound down, Elise found herself sitting on a bench with Karen, the single mother who had become one of the community's most vocal advocates. "This is incredible," Karen said, gesturing to the families still lingering at the park. "It feels hopeful." Elise nodded, her heart swelling. "Hope is what keeps us moving forward. And it's what will carry us through the challenges ahead." Karen smiled, her expression one of quiet determination. "Whatever comes next, count me in." At the precinct, Michael continued to implement changes aimed at improving transparency and accountability. He launched a series of quarterly report-back meetings where the department shared updates on their progress and gathered feedback from the community. One of the most impactful changes was the addition of a community advisory board made up of residents, business owners, and faith leaders. The board acted as a liaison between the department and the community, ensuring that voices from all walks of life were heard. During the first advisory board meeting, Michael listened as members shared their hopes and concerns. "We've seen progress," one board member said, "but there's still work to do. People need to know that this isn't just a phase, that it's real, and it's lasting." Michael nodded, his tone resolute. "I can promise you that. This isn't just a policy shift, it's a cultural shift, and I'm committed to seeing it through." Elise continued to expand her role as a community leader. She organized workshops on conflict resolution, hosted panels on restorative justice, and worked closely with local schools to implement programs that encouraged positive relationships between students and officers. At one workshop, a young woman approached Elise after the session. "Mrs. Turner," she said hesitantly, "I just wanted to thank you. I've always been afraid of the police, but hearing your story and seeing what you and your husband are doing, it's changed how I feel. It's given me hope." Elise placed a comforting hand on the woman's arm. "Thank you for sharing that. Change starts with conversations like this, and it starts with brave people like you." As the weeks passed, the initiatives began to show tangible results. Complaints of misconduct continued to decline, and surveys showed that trust in the department was steadily rising. Officers reported feeling more engaged and connected to the community, and residents expressed a renewed sense of safety and belonging. One evening, Michael and Elise sat together on the porch, reflecting on how far they had come. "You know," Michael said, his voice thoughtful, "there were times I didn't think we'd make it this far. But seeing the changes, the progress, it makes all the sacrifices worth it." Elise leaned against his shoulder, her smile soft. "We've done this together, Michael, and we've shown people what's possible when you refuse to give up." As they watched the city lights twinkle in the distance, they knew their work wasn't finished, but for the first time in a long time, they felt a deep sense of hope, not just for themselves, but for the community they had fought so hard to rebuild. Months turned into a year, and the changes Michael and Elise Turner had worked tirelessly to implement began to take root in the community. The precinct was no longer a place of hushed distrust and simmering tension. It had transformed into a hub of collaboration and transparency. Officers and residents alike were finding common ground, bridging divides that had once seemed insurmountable. Michael stood at the podium in a packed auditorium, the culmination of their efforts reflected in the faces of those seated before him. The room buzzed with anticipation as he prepared to deliver a speech on the anniversary of his tenure as captain. Elise sat in the front row, her smile steady and encouraging, the plaque from the Community Advisory Board resting on her lap. Michael cleared his throat, his voice resonating through the room. "A year ago, I stood here with a promise: to listen, to act, and to rebuild trust. That promise wasn't just wording, it was a commitment. Today I'm proud to say that we've made progress. It hasn't been easy, and it hasn't been perfect, but together we've shown that accountability and compassion can coexist." The audience broke into applause, the sound filling the room like a wave. As the speech concluded, Michael stepped down to join Elise, who squeezed his hand warmly. "You were incredible," she said, her voice soft but filled with pride. "I had the best inspiration," he replied with a smile. The progress they had made was evident everywhere they turned. The youth mentorship program had flourished, with dozens of young people finding guidance and purpose through their interactions with officers. One of the program's first participants, a teenager named Malik, stood at the back of the room, a shy but proud smile on his face. He had recently been accepted into a college criminal justice program, inspired by the officers he had met through the initiative. Elise walked over to Malik after the event. "Congratulations," she said warmly. "You're going to do great things." Malik grinned. "Thanks, Mrs. Turner. You and Captain Turner made this possible. I hope I can make a difference like you have." "You already are," Elise replied. Back at the precinct, Michael reflected on the lessons he had learned over the past year. He had faced resistance, doubt, and personal sacrifices, but he had also witnessed resilience, courage, and the power of community. Officers who had once been skeptical of his reforms now embraced them, finding renewed pride in their roles. Detective Carmen Hayes knocked on his door, stepping inside with a file in hand. "Captain," she said, "I thought you'd want to see this. It's the latest Community Trust Survey results." Michael opened the file, his eyes scanning the numbers. Trust in the department had increased by over 30%, a tangible sign that their efforts were making a difference. "This is incredible," he said, his voice tinged with relief. Carmen smiled. "You've earned it. We've earned it." At home, Elise's work continued to expand. The workshops she had organized had grown into a full-fledged community initiative, offering resources on conflict resolution, civic engagement, and leadership. Tasha had become one of her most trusted collaborators, bringing fresh ideas and youthful energy to every project. One afternoon, Elise and Tasha met at the community center to finalize plans for a new series of events focused on restorative justice. As they worked, Tasha paused, her expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Turner," she began, "do you ever think about how much things have changed?" Elise smiled. "All the time. But the change isn't just because of Michael and me, it's because of people like you, Grace, and everyone who believed in this community." Tasha nodded, her confidence growing. "Still, you showed us what was possible. You gave us the push we needed." The ripple effects of their work spread beyond their neighborhood. Other precincts in the city began adopting similar initiatives, inspired by Michael's leadership and Elise's community-driven approach. News outlets highlighted their efforts, framing them as a model for bridging the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. One evening, Michael and Elise received an invitation to speak at a citywide forum on public safety and community trust. Standing together on stage, they shared their journey, the challenges, the setbacks, and the victories. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Elise said to the audience. "It takes persistence, collaboration, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. But when people come together with a shared purpose, the possibilities are endless." Michael added, "Leadership isn't about power. It's about service. It's about lifting others and ensuring everyone feels seen, heard, and valued. That's how we build something lasting." The applause was deafening, a testament to the impact of their words and actions. As they walked home that evening, Elise looked up at the stars, their light steady and enduring. "Do you think we've done enough?" she asked quietly. Michael slipped his arm around her shoulders. "We've done what we could, and we've inspired others to keep going. That's what matters." Elise nodded, her heart full. They had faced challenges they couldn't have imagined, but they had emerged stronger, their bond unshaken, their commitment unwavering. Their story wasn't just about them, it was about the power of resilience, the strength of community, and the enduring hope that even the darkest days could give way to a brighter tomorrow. Thank you for joining us on this inspiring journey of courage, resilience, and hope. Michael and Elise Turner's story reminds us that even in the face of challenges, change is possible when we work together with determination and compassion. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up and share it with others who might need a little hope and inspiration today. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories like this one, and tap the notification bell so you never miss an update. Together, we can celebrate the power of community, perseverance, and the impact of one small step toward a brighter tomorrow. See you in the next story.